What's going on, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the College Football Predictions. This week, as you guys see, we don't have Colin Martin with us, but the show has to go on. So, starting off, it'll probably be a lot quicker of an episode as we see before. I'll just go through my rankings for this week, what we saw this week, some teams going down, some teams going up. And starting off with the 25th spot, I have Kansas here. I know a lot of people don't have them ranked at this point, but I still think they have that impressive win earlier in the season. I'm going to keep them at 25 here for now. I do think that they're still a solid squad. With 3 losses, there's a lot of different teams you could throw in here, including Kansas State. I just think Kansas has a bigger, better win than Kansas State to this point. Next up, North Carolina at the 24 spot. This team moves up 1 spot this week. Overall, I just think that as an 8-2 team overall, we've seen them struggle a little bit, but coming off of their games in the past few weeks, they've been able to bounce back, going up against Duke in a double overtime win. Duke has been a good team this year, though they've kind of fallen off a little bit from earlier in the season with that Riley Leonard injury. I think they're still a solid squad. Another good win for UNC. Next up in the 23 spot, Liberty. They move up again. They're 10-0 at this point. They're another solid squad where if they continue to win out, they could potentially maybe get in that top 20, maybe get a good bowl game by the end of the year, depending on what we see with some of this shakeup. And 10-0, obviously, Liberty not playing in one of these big 5 conferences. That's the only reason why they're not up there. I mean, if they were, they would be a top 5 school at this point, but obviously with the teams that they play against, you can't really put them that high. But 23, a ranked position for them, still pretty good at this point for a team that has been very solid. Next up, Notre Dame, very impressive 3-loss team. Obviously, they have some hiccups throughout the season, but still one of the best teams in the country. Sam Hartman has been good. Obviously, he was looking at a Heisman earlier in the year, kind of dropped down a little bit, but the team is still very, very solid. So I still think that they're one of the top 25 teams in the overall in the country, one of the best 3-loss teams. Not the best, though. That's only the second that we'll see on here so far, but there is a few better teams, in my opinion. Next up, like I said before, 3-loss teams. I have Arizona here. Arizona moves up a spot again. This team has been very good, as we know, going through that gauntlet, which we've previewed pretty much every week to this point. Then going up against Colorado, another big win for them. That was something to put on their resume, too. I know Colorado obviously fallen off since the beginning of the season when they were ranked, but still a tough team to go against with Shedeur Sanders, one of the best quarterbacks in college football right now. Next up, James Madison starting off the top 20. This is another team that playing lesser competition, but still 10-0 undefeated. And I think they're a little better than Liberty at this point, maybe played some harder competition. So that's why I have them above them at this point. But definitely a team that could maybe get into the top 15, depending on what we see with the rest of these squads towards the end of the year. Next up, we have Tennessee here at 19. Another 3-loss team, obviously coming off of that loss against Mizzou, a tough, tough loss. Colin's not on here to defend his prediction of the week, which we saw last week with Tennessee beating them. And obviously that kind of backfired. I had Mizzou in that game, and I was surprised on how easy Missouri went out there and won that game. Tennessee has a very tough matchup this week against Georgia, so we'll see exactly where they go with that. Still a very solid squad, so I wouldn't exactly write Tennessee out in this game with that high-powered offense. I do think Georgia is a lot better, obviously, but at home, I think this could be a sneaky close game. We saw what happened last year when Tennessee was number 1, but this could be a different story depending on which Joe Milton we get. If we see the Tennessee offense play the same way we saw last week, then it should be a blowout, but they do have a little bit of a chance going into this game. I wouldn't completely write them off. And then the 18 spot, I have Tulane here. I know I have them a lot higher than the AP and all the other places that put Tulane, but I just think they're a very solid squad at 9-1. You can't really look past that. They're in a little bit more of a competitive division, maybe playing some tougher competition than teams like JMU and Liberty. Their schedule has been tough this year, going up against Ole Miss earlier in the year. If they won that game, would be a lot higher, but at this point, still a very solid squad at 9-1. Next up, Oklahoma State. who is falling down a little bit this week. They just didn't perform the way I expected them to perform, to say the least, against UCF. I did not expect them to get blown out 45-3, and that does lose you a good amount of spots. I don't know necessarily where I would put them compared to a team like Tennessee. I do have them above, but I could see the argument for it. That win against Oklahoma, a big win against Kansas. So when I was looking at these teams this week, it just seems like they have bigger wins than Tennessee. Tennessee just doesn't really have that marquee win when we're looking at teams within the top 15. They are good, but I just don't really see the marquee win for Tennessee where Oklahoma State does, and obviously a big loss this week. They should be able to bounce back, though, a very solid Big 12 squad. Next up here, Utah, who drops down a little bit too. This team going out, losing to Washington, one of the best in the country. So I'm not going to drop them that much for this. They did keep it close, a 7-point game, but Penix, as we know, still my Heisman favorite, though you could easily make an argument for some other guys on this list. I think it is getting very close. Jayden Daniels, a very good football player at this point, which we'll talk about with LSU. But Utah taking the loss here, and it seems like their Pac-12 chances are pretty much thrown out now, but they still do have a good chance to get a bowl game. But like I said before, going into this big 3-game stretch towards the end of the year, Utah could struggle to be ranked at the end of the year, if we're being honest. I mean, this was the start with Washington this week. They're going to go up against Arizona, and then to end the season, they're going to go up against Colorado. If they win that game, I think they'll be fine, but it's going to be tough for them, especially even against Colorado. I think Colorado's offense is still very good. So they're going to be vying, especially if Colorado goes out and potentially wins this week. We could see what happens. I doubt that they get bowl eligible going up against WSU and Utah. Washington State has been good, but both of those teams still struggling. So if Colorado is 5-6 going up against Utah, they just might want it more. But for now, Utah's going to sit here at 16. LSU here at 15, another team that has definitely struggled with a tough schedule this year, but they've made the most out of it. If they had a lot easier schedule like some of these other teams, then we could easily see them be a top 10, top 5 team, but they vied for a tough schedule and some losses came with that, but still a top 15 team at this point. Jayden Daniels, one of the best quarterbacks in college football right now. He's played fantastic through the air and on the ground. I mean, this guy is a sensation to watch, and they move up a few spots this week. Another team moving up too is Oklahoma here in the 14 spot. They were good this week going up against West Virginia. Not too much to say about that, a 40-point victory. So I'm not too surprised by anything there. Oklahoma has kind of struggled a little bit recently with those losses, but they should be able to go out there for the rest of the season and win out. Going up against BYU and TCU, I would expect them to win. It's going to be tough. Obviously, Oklahoma State's still up there too. And with that loss to Oklahoma State, they do have the tiebreaker. So we could be in an instance where both of those teams still have the same conference record in the end, even though Oklahoma State has the worst overall record. So it's going to be very interesting. Oklahoma's probably going to need some help, even though technically I have them ranked better than Oklahoma State. They have the better record right now, but at the end of the day, the conference record and the tiebreaker is going to go to Oklahoma State. So they need some help here, but still a very good squad coming back off of those losses that we've seen the past few weeks, finally coming back and going against West Virginia, getting that 40-point victory. Next up, Penn State here at 13, dropping down after that loss to Michigan. Not too much to say from this game, except Penn State's offense just looked absolutely terrible. I know Michigan didn't have Jim Harbaugh this week. It really didn't matter. I was expecting J.J. McCarthy to go out here and potentially have that Heisman NFL talk game against a tough Penn State defense, but he threw the ball 8 times, and they just ran the ball. They ran the ball 46 times, 230 yards total, 3 touchdowns. Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards did exactly what they needed to do. They just didn't even need to throw the ball. And Penn State's offense, Drew Allar had 70 passing yards. They had more rushing yards from Kaytron Allen than Drew Allar had passing yards. And Kaytron Allen with only 12 carries, Drew Allar threw the ball 22 times. So what does that tell you? This offense, it has been awful. Ranked at 13 here, still one of the best teams in the country, but it's just tough when your offensive coordinator is running the ball on first and second down, and then you throw a screen pass on third down. On 3rd and 8, it doesn't really help anything. Drew Allard just throwing to ghosts in the field. Michigan, talk about them a little bit later, finally getting their first big win of the season against a ranked opponent, but expecting a little bit more from Penn State. And they kept it close throughout the whole entire game. They got a good defensive stops for a while. They just couldn't do anything offensively, and you can't win the game like that. And next up, Ole Miss, who went against Georgia this week, another big loss for them. They still are one of the best teams in the country. They go up against arguably the best team in the country, in my opinion, the best team in the country. They lose 52-17. They kept it close. They came out firing in the first quarter, but after that, Georgia just went through and pretty much scored 14 points every quarter besides the third, which they still scored 10. So double digits in every quarter. They were just going out there and slinging, running the ball, doing everything they needed to do. And Ole Miss just really couldn't keep up, which was surprising since that Ole Miss offense is very high powered. Georgia's defense just too good for them in the end. But still a good season from Ole Miss overall. I think they're officially out of the SEC race now, as we'll have Alabama and Georgia once again, but still a very productive season. They could end up in the top 10 depending on what we see for the rest of the season. Mizzou, though, at 11 here, they are also out of the SEC championship after that loss to Georgia. But another surprising year. I don't think anyone really saw Missouri being this good this year, and they came out on top against a tough Tennessee team. That was going to be a close game. I know the spread was very close going into this. I had Mizzou in the game. I didn't expect them to go out that well and play that good, but they did in the end. A near 30-point win, 29 points. Brady Cook did what he needed to do. Obviously, on the ground, that rushing game from Cody Schrader. He had 205 yards. They ran the ball 35 times with him, 51 rushes overall. They were just running down Tennessee's throat all game. It was just coming to them naturally at that point, and they got it done in the end. And I mean, a fantastic game if we're going to talk about Schrader too. He had 205 rushing yards, 116 receiving yards. Just a fantastic day. You can't really win a game if you're Tennessee, if on the opposite end, their running back is going out there and catching for 100 yards too, looking like a prime Christian McCaffrey out there. Mizzou, probably the biggest surprise of the year, in my opinion. I mean, you could either throw them or Louisville up there. Both of these teams are great. And then starting off the top 10, Oregon State here came out with a win, another big win for them, bouncing back after some losses earlier. Damian Martinez, no update from Colin this week from him. 4 touchdowns for Damian Martinez. So sad that he missed this episode when his boy went out there and scored 4 touchdowns and had a marquee game, 150 yards. And this guy, as a sophomore, I mean, he's going to be a dominant force in the NFL if he can continue to play at this rate. Next year's draft class with all those running backs, Nick Singleton, Quinshawn Judkins, even Damian Martinez too. All these guys are going to be fantastic running backs in the NFL. So another guy, great to see a sophomore playing this well already. Oregon State with another big win. Stanford, not the best team, but I mean, you went out and almost beat them by 50. That's impressive, no matter who you play against. Louisville comes in here at the 9 spot. This Louisville team, like I said before, one of the most impressive teams this year. A little bit of a surprise. It was a tough game against Virginia, but they still get it done in the end. That's really all that matters. They went out and got the 7-point win. This team still a top 10 team, in my opinion. They're going to go up against Miami in Miami. It's going to be a tough game. Miami's still a good competitive team this year, especially with an ACC matchup like that. So I think they could go out here and potentially get that win and continue to have their season roll. The ACC championship game could be fun to watch depending on who we see in there. I don't think there's any way that we don't see Florida State in there at this point. So hopefully we see Louisville go out there and play in that championship game, maybe get some little bit more credibility since Lamar Jackson has left. This is the highest they've been ranked since then. So good to see the program kind of coming back alive. And then in the 8th spot here, we have Oregon. I know I kind of moved them down a little bit, kind of in the 8th spot. I know some people think they're the best one-loss team, but I'll talk about a little bit later who I think is. Oregon's still very good overall, captained by Bo Nix. if you ask some people, they might say that he's the Heisman favorite right now. I think it's hard to make an argument against him, even though you could throw out Michael Penix saying that he beat him. But in the end, one of the best quarterbacks in college football right now, a draft prospect, maybe a little bit different story just since he's a little bit older, but still great game from him against USC. I mean, USC still a formidable opponent, even though they're not ranked anymore with Caleb Williams in their backfield. It's definitely going to be a tough game whenever you play against USC. So Oregon, still a good win for them this week. Texas, I did drop down this week after a close game against TCU. I know I had them in my top 6 before, but I just wasn't really as impressed with them this week. Quinn Ewers coming back into the starting lineup. He had a good game, did have the pick. Jonathan Brooks, 104 yards and 2 touchdowns. They got it done. And they had a big lead at halftime. They just almost blew the whole entire game in the fourth quarter. TCU scoring 20 in the fourth quarter. So it was a close game after that first quarter, obviously 7-6. Texas, pulls away 26-6 at halftime. And then it's a close, tight game, but Jonathan Brooks caught the touchdown with about 15 seconds left and ends up or with 15 seconds left in the first half, puts them up, and then they kind of barely get away with the win towards the end. They still do, though, but I was just impressed by another team, which I'll talk about right now. Starting off my top 6, Alabama, I just think I'll give them their props here. This defense is just very good. Going up against Kentucky, who is still a good opponent, they nearly, or I guess they did double their score plus more, beating them by almost 30 points in this game, a 28-point win, 4 scores. That's just a massive victory. Jalen Milroe had 6 touchdowns in this game. It's hard to look past this team. I think if there's any team that's built to go up against a team like Georgia and beat them, it is Alabama, just because both of those teams, very tough teams, especially within the SEC. So that championship game will be very fun to watch. And I've just been impressed with Alabama, especially throughout these past few weeks. As a Georgia fan, don't really want to give them their props unless I have to, but now I do think they are the best one-loss team. They're coming in at my 6th ranking right here. And starting off the top 5, pretty much everything stays the same here for me. Within these top 5 teams, I didn't really see too much to change anything. Obviously, Michigan had that big win, but Georgia also had that big win against Ole Miss. Ohio State had a big win against Michigan State, though Michigan State's not that good. Michigan just didn't really do too much to impress me to jump them over Ohio State, just because this was their first ranked win of the year. Ohio State still has multiple ranked wins, multiple big wins on the year. And Michigan, I don't know if they really ended up beating Penn State or Penn State kind of beat themselves at that point. I just think any team could go out there. If Michigan played the way that they did in this game, didn't really throw the ball, I know they didn't really need to, but it just seemed like there was definitely some holes out there. JJ McCarthy didn't really show too much. He didn't really need to. I know they didn't have their coach, but in the end, not really too much to change in the top 5 for me. Everything's going to stay the same with Florida State at 5, Washington at 4, Michigan at 3, Ohio State at 2, and Georgia at 1. Georgia, a massive win over Ole Miss, still my number 1 team in the country. And I don't think one ranked win in a close game against Penn State, even though Penn State's offense didn't do anything, moves them above Ohio State, who has some big marquee wins on this year, including games against Notre Dame, who was in the top 5 at one point, or the top 10 at that point, Penn State in the top 10 at that point. So both of those games, they end up getting those wins. So I think both of those wins just more impressive than Michigan at this point, but we can argue about that when they play. We'll see them play in a few weeks. So then we finally get to see, as people have been talking throughout this whole year. I know we've been on here talking about how Ohio State is better than Michigan up to this point. So we will see next week who the better team really is in the end. This week, not too many massive games just because we're getting towards the end of the schedule, but we still have Georgia and Tennessee. I think that'll be a good game to watch. I think Georgia should come away with a win, but I do think it may be a little closer than some people predict just because of Tennessee's losses throughout the past few weeks. I still think they can go out there and win. Utah and Arizona should be a fun game within the Pac-12. And overall, there's still some other good matchups too. Kansas State and Kansas. I think both of those teams can go out there and get a big win. It's going to be a close game between those two teams. I know I have Kansas ranked. Some people have Kansas State ranked. So either of those teams can go out and show which team is better. And with that being said, also the Washington and Oregon State game, that should be a good one. Interesting game there within the Pac-12, a lot of implications on the line. Michael Penix, another potential Heisman performance for him against a tough Oregon State team who is favored right now. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure the rankings will be different by the time I see you guys next week. Hopefully we will have Colin back with us next week. The last week before we go into the final week of the season, where we will see the big Michigan and Ohio State matchup with some other big ones too that we'll see. So I'll see you guys next week with the updated rankings.